Welcome back to comfy sleeping. Get comfortable now. Let your body sink into the bed. Let your eyes close, even if you keep listening for a while yet. Tonight, we're not traveling to one place or one age. Tonight, we're following a single, quiet idea, all the way from the beginning. The idea of money. Not the coins in your pocket or the numbers on a screen, but the strange, invisible agreement underneath all of it. The shared belief that lets a stranger hand you bread in exchange for a piece of metal, or paper, or nothing at all, but a number that moves from one account to another. It's one of the oldest and strangest inventions our species ever made. Older than writing in some forms. Older than most of the empires we usually study. And it never once needed to be true in any physical sense. Only believed. We'll move through it slowly, the way it actually happened. Not in one clean line, but in fits and starts, across cattle fields and salt roads and cacao markets, through Lydian workshops and Chinese printing houses, through Florentine banking houses and English goldsmiths' vaults, all the way to the quiet, glowing numbers on the screen of a phone. There's no need to remember any of it. Just let it drift past you, soft and unhurried. You don't need to hold onto any names or dates tonight. No test at the end, nothing to remember in the morning. Just a long, slow walk backward through everything humans have ever agreed together to treat as valuable. Cattle once, then salt, then shells, then stamped metal, then paper, then simply numbers, quietly trusted, moving between accounts. Picture, for a moment, what the very first exchange of value might have sounded like. Not the clink of coins, because there were none yet. Just voices, low and careful, in a marketplace of goods with no fixed price. A woman offering dried fish for a length of woven cloth. A man weighing out grain against the worth of a knife. Every trade its own small negotiation, its own small story, settled and then forgotten. That's the world we're stepping into tonight. A world before money, slowly becoming a world with it. Chapter 1: The Myth of the Barter Economy. For a long time, the story most of us were taught went something like this. Before money, people bartered. A farmer with too much wheat would find a shepherd with too much wool, and the two would trade directly, wheat for wool, goods for goods. And money, in this telling, was simply invented later to make that clumsy process easier. It's a tidy story, and it comes from a very old and very influential source, the 18th century economist Adam Smith, who used it to explain why money exists at all. But historians and anthropologists who have actually gone looking for a society that ran primarily on direct barter between strangers have had a hard time finding one. Not none ever. Anywhere small, occasional barter has existed in many places, but a whole functioning economy built on it, the way Smith described, is very hard to document. What they find instead, again and again, in the oldest records we have, is something closer to credit and memory. A farmer gives a neighbor grain now, and it's remembered, informally, that the neighbor owes something back, someday, of roughly equal worth. Debts tracked not in coin, but in relationships, in reputation, in the kind of trust that exists between people who expect to see each other again next season, and the season after that. This matters for tonight's story because it changes where money actually starts. Not as a fix for the clumsiness of barter, but as a way of making informal, personal debts formal, portable, and impersonal. Something you could owe or be owed by someone you'd never met and might never see again. We'll come back to credit and debt more than once tonight. It turns out to be the quieter, older thread running underneath almost everything we're about to cover. Some of the clearest evidence for this comes from the very earliest written records we have at all. In ancient Mesopotamia, among the clay tablets of Sumerian temple and palace administrations, historians find something that looks less like a marketplace and more like a ledger. Debts recorded in fixed units, often a weight of silver or a measure of barley, tracked carefully over months and years, long before anyone in the region was using stamped coins of any kind. The anthropologist David Grieber, whose book on the long history of debt gathered much of this evidence together, argued that these early record-keeping systems functioned as a kind of accounting for obligation. Who had given grain to the temple stores, who had borrowed seed for planting, who owed labor or goods back at harvest. Money, in this view, began less as a physical object and more as a unit for measuring a relationship of trust that already existed and needed to be remembered accurately. None of this erases the fact that direct, spot barter did happen here and there, especially between strangers with no ongoing relationship and no shared authority to appeal to. But as the primary engine of a whole functioning economy, it seems to have been the exception, not the rule. The rule, far more often, was memory, obligation, and trust, long before it was metal changing hands. For now, just picture that early marketplace again. Not two people swapping goods on the spot, but a slower, longer memory. A running tally, kept in minds and in trust, of who owed what to whom. And somewhere in that tally, the first seed of an idea that would eventually need something more solid to stand on. Chapter 2. The first monies were alive. Long before coins, many societies settled on something to serve as a shared measure of value. And remarkably often, especially among cattle-herding peoples, that something was cattle themselves. In much of the ancient Mediterranean world, in parts of Africa, and among early Indo-European peoples, livestock functioned as a kind of currency. Not something you'd necessarily hand over for every small purchase, but a recognized store of wealth. a way of settling large debts, paying fines, and offering bride wealth at a marriage. The connection runs deep enough to survive in language itself. The Latin word for money, pecunia, comes from pecus, meaning cattle or livestock. The English word capital traces back through a similar root tied to caput, head, as in counting wealth by heads of cattle. Even fee in English descends from an old Germanic word for cattle. Using livestock, as money had obvious problems. A cow is not easily divided into small change. It can die. It needs to be fed and tended. And its exact value could vary animal to animal. But it solved a real problem too. Unlike a handful of grain, cattle held their value over time, could be moved from place to place, and were recognized as valuable across a wide, shared culture. They had, in the language economists would use much later, durability and portability. Two of the qualities anything trying to function as money still needs today. Homer's Iliad, composed from oral traditions describing a much older Bronze Age world, gives us a small, striking glimpse of this cattle-based way of measuring worth. In one passage, two warriors, Glaucus and Diomedes, pause in the middle of battle to exchange armor as a gesture of guest friendship. And the poem notes, almost in passing, that one set of armor was worth 9 oxen, and the other worth 100. A whole scale of value, quietly assumed by the audience listening, built entirely around cattle as the common measure. In many pastoral societies across Eastern and Southern Africa, a version of this same logic persisted for a very long time, and in some communities persists in some form even now. Cattle serving not just as wealth to be traded, but as the customary currency of marriage itself, paid by a groom's family to a bride's family, as what anthropologists call bride wealth. A public, socially recognized transfer of value that helped bind two families together. Slowly, across many societies, people began reaching for objects that solved these same problems more cleanly. Smaller, more durable, easier to divide and carry. And that search would eventually lead in some very different directions at once, on opposite sides of the world. Chapter 3: Salt, Soldiers, and a Word We Still Use. Salt held a strange kind of value in the ancient world that's easy to forget today, now that it sits nearly free on every table. Before refrigeration, salt was one of the only reliable ways to preserve meat and fish through the year, which meant, in a very real sense, it stood between a community and hunger in the leaner months. Because of that, salt was traded, taxed, and fought over across huge stretches of Africa, the Mediterranean, and Asia. Salt caravans crossed the Sahara for centuries. Salt roads connected inland regions to the coast. And in some times and places, salt itself functioned as a form of money, weighed out and exchanged for other goods. Here's where we have to slow down and be careful. because one of the most commonly repeated facts about salt is more legend than history. You may have heard that Roman soldiers were paid in salt, and that this is where the English word salary comes from. The word does come from the Latin salarium, which is connected to sal, salt. But historians are genuinely divided on exactly what that connection meant in practice. It may have referred to an allowance given to soldiers specifically to buy salt, rather than actual salt handed over as wages. The full truth is less certain than the popular version suggests, and worth holding a little loosely. What is well documented is that salt remained economically important for a very long time. Salt taxes funded governments. Salt monopolies were jealously guarded by rulers, and access to salt routes shaped the location of cities and the paths of trade for centuries. In Central Europe, the salt mines around Hallstatt, in what is now Austria, grew so wealthy from salt production that the surrounding Iron Age culture takes its name from the site itself. Entire settlements organized their lives and their trade networks around this one preserved, precious substance, buried deep in the mountain, and carried out along routes that connected the Alps to distant markets. Centuries later, the city of Venice built a significant part of its early trading wealth on a tightly held salt monopoly, controlling supply along the Adriatic, and using the profits to help fund the merchant fleets that would eventually make it one of the most powerful trading cities in the Mediterranean. Even the old Roman road linking Rome to the Adriatic coast, the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, carries the substance's name directly into its own, a route worn smooth by centuries of carts and pack animals hauling salt inland. Traces of salt's old economic weight linger in language even now, well beyond the disputed word salary. The English phrase, worth one's salt, describing someone who earns their keep, or the custom in some old European households of seating the most honored guests above the salt, closer to the prized salt cellar at the head of the table. Both carry a faint memory of a time when this one seasoning was valuable enough to organize a household and an economy around. Salt, though, like cattle before it, had real limits as a form of money. It dissolved, it could be adulterated, and its value could shift with a good or bad harvest season elsewhere. On the far side of the world, an entirely different society was solving the same basic problem with something that looked nothing like salt at all. Chapter 4: Cacao beans as currency in Mesoamerica. In Mesoamerica, among the Aztec and neighboring peoples, cacao beans, the raw ingredient of chocolate, served for centuries as a genuine, widely used form of money. Cacao beans were small, reasonably durable if kept dry, and easy to count out in specific quantities. Spanish chroniclers arriving in the 16th century recorded market prices in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, set directly in cacao beans. a rabbit for a certain number of beans, a turkey egg for a smaller number still. Cacao wasn't only currency, of course. It was also brewed into a prized, often ceremonial drink, reserved in its finest forms for nobility, warriors, and religious rites. Which means the beans carried a kind of built-in cultural value on top of their usefulness as money, in much the way gold would later carry both monetary and ornamental worth in other civilizations. And where there is money, however humble the object, there is eventually counterfeiting. Spanish colonial records describe people hollowing out cacao beans and refilling them with dirt or other filler material, then mixing the fakes in with real beans to pass them off in trade. A small, very human detail that connects a 15th century marketplace in Tenochtitlan to every counterfeit coin or forged banknote that would come long after it. Spanish chroniclers, including the Friar Bernardino de Sahagún, recorded surprisingly precise cacao exchange rates from Aztec markets. A good turkey hen for around 100 beans, a smaller turkey egg for as few as 3, an avocado for a single bean, depending on the season and quality. Cacao was also demanded as a form of tribute, with some conquered provinces required to send enormous quantities of beans to the Aztec capital every year as a condition of the empire's rule. Cacao's dual identity, a genuine currency on one hand, a rare and ceremonially important drink on the other, meant its value carried a kind of cultural weight that plain metal coinage would later lack. The beans weren't just spent, they were also, on important occasions, still quietly consumed. Chapter 5: Shells and Stones That Never Moved. Cattle, salt, and cacao were not the only unlikely objects that came to serve as currency across the ancient and early modern world. In many coastal and inland regions of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, small cowrie shells, the smooth, glossy shells of a particular sea snail, gathered largely from the Maldive Islands in the Indian Ocean, circulated as money for an extraordinarily long stretch of history, in some places for well over 1,000 years. Cowries had real advantages. They were small, durable, difficult to counterfeit convincingly, and naturally limited in supply, since they had to be gathered, cleaned, and transported from a relatively small number of source regions. They turn up in the archaeological and historical record from West Africa to South Asia to parts of China, carried along the same trade networks that moved silk, spices, and salt. Perhaps the most remarkable currency in this whole story, though, comes from the small Pacific island of Yap, in what is now Micronesia. For centuries, the people of Yap used enormous carved stone discs, some over 10 feet across, known as rai, as a form of high-value currency. What makes Yap's stone money so striking is this. These massive stones were often left exactly where they were first placed, sometimes even at the bottom of the sea if one had been lost in transport centuries earlier. And ownership simply changed hands through shared community memory and agreement, without the stone itself ever moving an inch. Value tracked entirely by a trusted collective record of who owned what, rather than by physical possession at all. It's a detail worth holding onto quietly, because it will echo in a very different form much later in tonight's story. When we reach the paper ledgers of medieval bankers, and eventually the electronic account balances of the modern world, we'll find the same basic idea reappearing again and again. That money has never really needed to physically move at all, so long as everyone involved trusts the same shared record of who owns what. Cacao money and salt money, and cattle money and cowrie shells, and Yap's great stones all shared the same fundamental shape. Something with recognized value, agreed on across a wide community, useful enough to want and scarce enough to matter. What none of them had yet was a standardized shape, or an authority stamping a guarantee onto every piece. That change, when it came, would happen almost by accident in a small kingdom on the edge of the Aegean. Chapter 6: The Invention of Coinage in Lydia. Sometime in the 7th century BCE, in the kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey, something new appeared in the archaeological record. Small lumps of electrum, a naturally occurring gold-silver alloy, stamped with an official design and issued in standard weights. This is widely considered, by the evidence we currently have, the birthplace of true coinage. Not simply valuable metal-changing hands, which had happened for a long time already in various forms, but metal pieces of guaranteed weight and purity, marked by a ruling authority whose stamp told a merchant, at a glance, roughly what the piece was worth, without needing to weigh or test it every single time. That single innovation, an official guarantee stamped onto a standard unit, solved a problem that had slowed down trade for as long as trade had existed. Before coinage, every exchange involving precious metal required weighing, and often testing purity, a slow and easily disputed process. A stamped coin from a trusted source let two strangers trade quickly, with a shared confidence in what was actually being exchanged. Lydia sat at a genuine crossroads of the ancient world, along trade routes linking Greek city-states to the interior of Anatolia and beyond, which likely helped this new idea spread quickly once it proved useful. And it was under one particular Lydian king that this new invention became something like legendary. The ancient historian Herodotus, writing a couple of centuries later, credited the Lydians directly with being the first people known to mint gold and silver coinage and use it in everyday retail trade. Archaeologists have since recovered a hoard of very early electrum coins, from beneath the foundations of the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Offerings left by worshippers, giving modern researchers a rare, carefully dated snapshot of coinage in its earliest years. The natural inconsistency of electrum itself, a raw alloy whose exact gold to silver ratio could vary somewhat from one source to another, was, in fact, part of what made a trusted official stamp so valuable in the first place. Without some guarantee, two lumps of electrum of the same size might genuinely differ in worth. But a stamp from a recognized authority meant a merchant no longer had to gamble on that difference with every single transaction. Chapter 7: Croesus and the Wealth That Became a Saying. Croesus, who ruled Lydia in the 6th century BCE, became so associated with wealth that his name survives today in the English phrase, rich as Croesus. Under his reign, Lydia refined coinage further, issuing separate, standardized gold and silver coins rather than the earlier electrum alloy, each stamped with the same royal guarantee. Ancient writers, including the Greek historian Herodotus, describe Croesus as fabulously wealthy, generous to foreign visitors, and deeply confident in his own fortune. Herodotus tells a now famous story, likely at least partly legendary in its details, of Croesus asking the Athenian lawgiver Solon who was the happiest man alive, expecting to hear his own name, only to be told that no one's fortune can be judged happy until their whole life, including its ending, has played out. That warning, in the story as Herodotus tells it, proved uncomfortably accurate. Before going to war with the rising Persian Empire, Croesus is said to have consulted the famous oracle at Delphi and received a now legendary, carefully ambiguous answer: that if he crossed a certain river to attack, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus, confident, assumed the prophecy meant Persia's empire. It meant his own. Croesus's kingdom fell to Cyrus the Great of Persia in the 6th century BCE, and Lydia's brief moment as an independent center of golden wealth and early coinage came to an end as a kingdom. In some later versions of the story, Croesus survives his defeat and is even taken into Cyrus's court as an advisor. His wealth gone, but his hard-won wisdom, at least in legend, finally worth something to the very empire that had ended his reign. But the invention outlived the king. Once neighboring Greek city-states saw what standardized, stamped coinage could do for trade, they adopted and adapted the idea quickly, and coinage spread across the Mediterranean world far faster than any single kingdom's rise or fall. Chapter 8: Greek Coinage and the Rise of Trading Cities. Greek city-states each began minting their own coins, often stamped with a symbol tied closely to civic identity. Athens is the clearest example. Its silver tetradrachm, coins carrying the image of an owl, sacred to the city's patron goddess Athena. Alongside her profile on the coin's other face. Other cities chose their own emblems just as deliberately. Corinth minted coins showing Pegasus, the winged horse of its own local mythology, while the island of Aegina, one of the very earliest Greek states to strike coinage at all, used the image of a sea turtle. A quiet nod to the maritime trade its economy depended on. These Athenian owls, backed by rich silver deposits from nearby mines, became one of the most widely trusted and widely circulated currencies of the ancient Mediterranean. Merchants far outside Athens's own borders accepted them readily, because their silver content and weight were reliably consistent, coin after coin, year after year. Coinage in this period wasn't only economic. It was also a quiet form of civic advertising and pride. A city's coins traveled to distant ports, carrying its symbols and its name. A small stamped ambassador riding along in a merchant's purse, long before flags or postage stamps existed to serve a similar purpose. Athens's silver, mined from the rich deposits at Lorien, not far from the city, did more than fund ordinary trade. It helped pay for the large fleet of warships, the triremes, that made Athens a serious naval power. And it helped finance the treasury of the Delian League, an alliance of Greek city-states that Athens increasingly came to dominate, in part simply because it controlled the coinage so much of the alliance relied on. When Alexander the Great's conquests, in the 4th century BCE, briefly united an enormous stretch of territory from Greece to Egypt to the edge of India, his coinage and the broader Greek-style approach to minting spread with his armies, influencing currencies across a vast new range of cultures, long after his own empire had fractured among his successors. Chapter 9. Rome's currency and the face of the emperor. Rome developed its own rich and evolving coinage system over centuries, most famously the silver denarius and the bronze sestertius, and later the gold aureus, coins that circulated across an empire, eventually stretching from Britain to the edge of Persia. The denarius, in particular, became the backbone of ordinary Roman economic life. It was the coin used to pay the legions their stipendium, their regular soldier's wage, and archaeologists have recovered Roman coin hoards remarkably far from Rome itself, as far as southern India and parts of Southeast Asia, carried along maritime and overland trade routes that linked the empire to the wider ancient world. Roman coins carried something new and politically powerful: the image of the emperor's own face, often paired with symbols of military victories, temples, or virtues the ruler wished to be associated with. For many people at the far edges of the empire who would never see the emperor in person, his coin was the only image of him they would ever encounter. A portrait and a message passed hand to hand across an entire civilization. This made coinage a tool of both commerce and propaganda at once. A new emperor's coins could announce a change in power to the furthest provinces faster than any letter or messenger, simply by entering circulation and being handed across market stalls and pay lines for the legions. Roman mints operated across many cities of the empire, not just in Rome itself, and the sheer scale of Roman coin production, sustained across centuries, left behind one of the richest archaeological records of any ancient currency. Modern metal detectorists and archaeologists across former Roman territory, from Britain to North Africa, still regularly uncover buried hoards of these coins, often hidden by their owners during moments of unrest or invasion, and simply never reclaimed, small time capsules of trust placed in the ground, and then, for one reason or another, forgotten. For centuries, this system worked remarkably well, tying an enormous, diverse empire together through a shared, trusted medium of exchange. But that trust, like the coins themselves, would eventually be worn thin. Chapter 10: Debasement and the Slow Failure of a Currency. Beginning particularly in the 3rd century CE, facing mounting military costs and financial strain, Roman authorities began quietly reducing the actual silver content of the denarius, mixing in cheaper metals while keeping the coin's face value and appearance largely the same. At first, this went largely unnoticed by ordinary people, who continued trading the coins at their stated worth. But as the debasement continued, decade after decade, the coin's real silver content fell sharply, and prices across the empire began to rise, as people gradually recognized that the coins in their hands were worth less than they appeared. Historians view this debasement as one contributing factor among several serious military and political pressures in the broader instability of the Roman Empire's 3rd century. Modern analysis of surviving coins suggests the denarius's silver content, which had stood above 90% in the early empire, fell to just a few percent by the worst years of that century's crisis, with prices for ordinary goods rising sharply as people slowly realized what they were actually holding. The Emperor Diocletian, ruling at the end of that century, attempted to address the resulting inflation directly with a famous, sweeping edict fixing maximum prices for a huge range of goods and services across the empire. It largely failed, difficult to enforce across such a vast territory, but it stands as one of history's earliest large-scale attempts by a government to fight inflation by decree, rather than by restoring the currency's real underlying value. His successor, Constantine, later introduced a new, more reliably pure gold coin, the solidus, which went on to remain remarkably stable for centuries, long after the western half of the empire itself had fallen. It's a clear early example of a lesson that would repeat itself in different forms throughout the rest of this story. a currency's value ultimately rests on trust in whoever stands behind it. And that trust, once damaged, is very hard to fully restore. While Rome's coinage struggled on the other side of the world, a very different approach to money was quietly taking shape, one that would eventually abandon metal coins altogether. Chapter 11: Paper Promises in Tang and Song Dynasty China. During China's Tang Dynasty, merchants operating across long trade distances began using a system called fakian, often translated as flying cash. Rather than carry heavy strings of copper coins across dangerous roads, a merchant could deposit money with a trusted agent in one city and receive a certificate redeemable for the same amount in another city, far away. This was less a true currency in itself and more an early form of transferable credit. But it planted an important seed. Value could be represented on paper, moved across distance far more easily than physical coin, so long as both ends of the arrangement trusted the same issuing authority. That seed grew fully during the following Song Dynasty, in the early 11th century, when the government of Sichuan province authorized the issuing of jiaozi, widely regarded by historians as the world's first true government-backed paper currency, rather than simply a private credit certificate. The jiaozi notes were originally issued by a small group of trusted merchant houses in the city of Chengdu, who accepted heavy iron coin deposits from traders and issued lighter paper certificates in return. When some of these merchant issuers ran into financial trouble and failed to honor their notes, the Song government stepped in the year 1023 to take over issuance itself, backing the currency with state authority rather than private merchant credit alone. Printers used carved wooden blocks and multiple colors of ink, specifically to make the notes harder to forge. An early ancestor of the anti-counterfeiting design work still built into paper currency today. Paper currency solved real, practical problems. China's economy at the time relied heavily on iron and copper coins, which were heavy, especially in large quantities, and difficult to transport safely over long merchant routes. Paper notes, backed by the state's promise and eventually printed with anti-counterfeiting designs, offered a much lighter, more practical alternative for an economy growing more complex and more far-reaching by the century. Chapter 12: Marco Polo's Strange and Wonderful Report. By the 13th century, under the Mongol-founded Yuan dynasty and its Emperor Kublai Khan, paper currency had become deeply embedded in Chinese economic life, backed firmly by state authority, and used widely across the empire. When the Venetian merchant traveler Marco Polo visited the Mongol court and later described what he'd seen to audiences back in Europe, the idea of paper money struck many listeners as almost unbelievable. A piece of paper bearing an official seal that people would accept as being worth as much as gold or silver, simply because the ruling authority declared it so, and everyone agreed to honor that declaration. Polo's account, later recorded in his book, often known as the Travels, describes the process in some detail. How the paper was made from mulberry bark, how officials stamped and signed it, and how anyone refusing to accept it as payment could face serious punishment. A system held together by a mixture of trust, convenience, and the very real authority of the state standing behind it. Polo also describes a practical detail that modern currencies still echo in their own way. Notes that became worn or damaged could be brought back to imperial offices and exchanged for fresh ones for a small fee, keeping the currency in circulation clean and legible. And counterfeiting the emperor's paper money, Polo reports, was treated as seriously as counterfeiting gold or silver coin would have been anywhere else, punishable by death. It would still be centuries before paper currency took hold widely in Europe. But the underlying idea Marco Polo carried home in his stories, that money doesn't need to contain its own value, so long as enough people trust the authority guaranteeing it, was quietly, slowly, planting itself in the European imagination. Chapter 13. The Silk Road and Trust Across Great Distances. Long trade routes like the Silk Road connected China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe for centuries, carrying silk, spices, and countless other goods across enormous distances. And alongside those goods traveled something less visible, but just as essential. Systems of trust, credit, and shared value that let merchants do business with people they had never met, and often never would. A merchant setting out on a months-long journey couldn't practically carry enough coin to cover every possible transaction along the way, and doing so would have made them an obvious target for robbery. Instead, networks of trusted intermediaries, letters of credit, and reputations built carefully over years let value move across cultures and languages without every transaction requiring physical currency to change hands on the spot. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's easy to imagine ancient trade as simply coin for goods, goods for coin. In reality, much of the wealth genuinely moving across the ancient and medieval world moved as promises, reputations, and written credit, backed by relationships that stretched across cities, cultures, and sometimes entire religions. Physical infrastructure grew up around this trust, too. Caravanserais, fortified rest stops spaced along the major routes, offered merchants safe lodging for themselves, their animals, and their goods, becoming natural hubs where credit arrangements, contracts, and reputations were exchanged as often as physical merchandise. Certain merchant communities, such as the Radhanite Jewish traders active from roughly the 8th to the 10th century, became especially known for operating extended networks of trust and credit stretching from Western Europe all the way to China, moving value across religious and political boundaries that often had little else in common. One of the clearest and most surprising examples of that kind of trust network would take shape not among merchants first, but among a militarized religious order formed to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land. Chapter 14: Byzantium and the coin that held its value for centuries. While Rome's Western currency struggled through debasement and eventual collapse, the eastern half of the empire, which historians now generally call the Byzantine Empire, found a way to keep a single, trusted gold coin remarkably stable for an extraordinary length of time. That coin, the solidus, first introduced under Constantine and maintained carefully by his successors, kept its gold content close to consistent for roughly 7 centuries, an almost unheard of run of currency stability across the whole of this story. Merchants across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and beyond came to trust the solidus so completely that it functioned, for long stretches, as something close to an international reserve currency of its own era, accepted readily far outside Byzantine territory itself. Historians sometimes point to the solidus as a clear demonstration of the opposite lesson from Rome's earlier denarius, where relentless debasement had slowly destroyed trust in the old Roman silver coin. Careful, disciplined restraint in minting, the solidus preserved trust in it for centuries, even as the empire behind it faced wars, plagues, and constantly shifting borders. The coin itself outlasted the stability of almost everything around it, a quiet testament to how much a currency's strength depends on the discipline of whoever controls its minting. Chapter 15: The Sakk and the word Cheque. Centuries before the Knights Templar built their network of letters of credit across Europe and the Holy Land, merchants across the Islamic world had already developed a strikingly similar solution of their own. During the long, prosperous stretch of history, often called the Islamic Golden Age, traders operating across the vast territory of the early Abbasid Caliphate, stretching from North Africa through the Middle East and into Central Asia, faced the same basic danger merchants everywhere faced. Carrying large sums of coin across long, exposed trade routes was risky, slow, and an open invitation to robbery. Their solution was a written order called a Sakk, instructing a banker or agent in one city to pay a specified sum to the bearer, redeemable at a different location entirely. A merchant could deposit funds with a trusted banker in Baghdad, receive a Sakk, and travel on to Basra or Cairo, or even further, confident that presenting the document to a corresponding banker, there would produce the equivalent sum, without a single coin needing to physically make the dangerous journey at all. The word itself, carried west through trade and translation over the centuries, is widely believed to be the distant ancestor of the modern English word cheque. This wasn't the only financial innovation to travel along these same routes. Islamic scholars and merchants of this period also refined practices around credit, partnership investment, and long-distance trade finance that would later influence, directly or indirectly, financial practices further west. As trade, translation, and travel slowly carried ideas across the Mediterranean and beyond, the same way it had always carried silk, spices, and coin. Chapter 16: The Knights Templars Banking Network. The Knights Templar, founded in the early 12th century to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, grew over the following 2 centuries into something far larger and more complex than a simple military order. Because pilgrims traveling from Europe to the Holy Land faced serious danger, carrying large amounts of coin across such a long, exposed journey, the Templars developed a system allowing a traveler to deposit funds at one Templar house in Europe and withdraw an equivalent amount using a coded letter of credit at a Templar house near their destination. This functioned, in practice, remarkably like an early international bank. The Templars held property and wealth across a wide network of fortified houses throughout Europe and the Near East, and their reputation for both military strength and financial reliability made their letters of credit widely trusted among travelers, nobles, and even kings. At its height, the order maintained several hundred of these fortified houses, or commanderies, scattered from England and France down through Iberia and across to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. A pilgrim could deposit a sum at the Temple Church in London, receive a carefully coded document identifying the deposit, and later present it at a Templar house near Jerusalem to withdraw an equivalent amount, all without carrying a single coin across some of the most dangerous roads in the medieval world. This vast financial network came to an abrupt and dramatic end in the early 14th century, when King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the order and eager to seize its wealth, orchestrated the arrest and suppression of the Templars, leading eventually to the order's dissolution. A stark reminder that even a trusted financial network's fate can still depend heavily on the political fortunes of the powerful institutions and rulers around it. But the underlying model the Templars had helped demonstrate, that value could move safely across long distances as a letter and a trusted name, rather than as physical coin, didn't disappear with them. It would resurface again, refined and formalized, in the trading cities of Renaissance Italy. Chapter 17: The Medici and the Birth of Modern Banking. In 14th and 15th century Florence, the Medici family built one of history's most influential banking houses, and in doing so, helped shape financial practices still recognizable in modern banking today. The bank itself was founded in 1397 by Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, whose careful, conservative approach to lending set the foundation for the family's later rise. The Medici Bank and its Italian contemporaries relied heavily on the bill of exchange, a written instrument allowing a merchant in one city to pay a merchant in another city without physically transporting gold or silver coin between them. Alongside this, Italian merchants and bankers refined double entry bookkeeping, a method of recording every transaction twice as both a debit and a credit, making it far easier to track a business's true financial position at a glance. These weren't flashy inventions. They were quiet, careful improvements to record keeping and trust. But they allowed banking houses like the Medicis to operate branches across multiple cities and even countries, extending credit, financing trade, and eventually financing rulers, and even the Catholic Church itself, all while keeping careful, auditable track of who owed what to whom. The Medici family's financial power eventually translated into enormous political influence in Florence and beyond, funding art, architecture, and patronage on a scale that shaped the wider Italian Renaissance. A reminder that the history of money and the history of art, politics, and power have rarely stayed neatly separate from one another. The bank structure itself was carefully designed to limit risk, organized as a set of semi-independent partnerships across different cities: Rome, Venice, Bruges, London, rather than a single centralized business, so that a serious loss in one branch wouldn't automatically sink the whole enterprise. For a long stretch, this made the Medici Bank one of the most trusted financial institutions in Europe, managing accounts for the papacy itself alongside merchants, nobles, and other rulers. It's worth noting, too, as a quiet coda, that the bank eventually declined and collapsed in the final years of the 15th century, weakened by poor leadership under later generations and a series of bad loans to unreliable rulers. A reminder that trust, once carefully built over decades, can still be spent carelessly. Chapter 18: Notched Sticks and the English Exchequer. Before Goldsmiths' receipts began circulating in London, medieval England had already been running an entirely different and remarkably durable system for recording royal debts: the tally stick. A tally stick was a simple length of wood, notched along one edge to represent a specific sum owed, then split lengthwise down its middle into two matching pieces. One half, called the stock, was kept by the person owed the money, and the other half, the foil, was kept by the debtor. Because the wood's natural grain made each half's notches, and split uniquely impossible to fake or match with any other pair, the two halves together formed a record that couldn't easily be forged, altered, or disputed. England's royal treasury, the Exchequer, relied on tally sticks for centuries, recording taxes owed, loans made to the crown, and payments due, in a system that functioned in its own quiet wooden way, remarkably like a bond or a receipt. Tallies representing government debt could even be bought, sold, and traded among merchants and investors, functioning as a genuine, if unusual, financial instrument, centuries before formal paper banknotes existed in England at all. The system finally fell out of official use in the early 19th century, replaced by paper record keeping. And in one strange, almost fitting historical footnote, when officials decided in 1834 to dispose of the enormous accumulated stockpile of old, obsolete tally sticks by burning them in a furnace beneath the House of Lords, the resulting fire burned out of control and destroyed much of the old palace of Westminster itself. A quiet reminder that even the physical remnants of an old monetary system can leave a surprisingly large mark on history, right up to their very last use. Chapter 19: Goldsmiths and the Accidental Invention of the Banknote. In 17th century England, a new and almost accidental step toward modern paper currency emerged, not from a government mint, but from the private vaults of London goldsmiths. Goldsmiths, already equipped with secure vaults for storing precious metal, began accepting deposits of gold and silver coin from merchants and wealthy individuals for safekeeping, issuing a written receipt in return, promising to return the deposited coin on demand. Slowly, something unplanned began happening. Instead of redeeming these receipts for coin, and then paying that coin to a third party, people began simply handing the receipt itself directly to whoever they owed, who would in turn trust the goldsmith's name enough to accept it as payment, or pass it along again themselves. Without anyone fully designing it as a system, these goldsmiths' receipts began circulating as a form of money in their own right, backed not by government decree, but by trust in a specific goldsmith's reputation, and the gold actually sitting in his vault. An early, informal ancestor of the modern banknote, born less from grand design than from ordinary convenience. These goldsmiths' notes, as they came to be known in London, carried a real, largely unspoken risk alongside their convenience. A goldsmith who issued more notes than the gold he actually held in reserve was, in effect, quietly gambling that not everyone holding his notes would show up to redeem them for real coin at the same time. When confidence in a particular goldsmith wavered for any reason, a rush of people all demanding their gold at once could reveal the gap and ruin him. An early, small-scale preview of what modern economies would later call a bank run. Chapter 20: Tulips and the First Great Speculative Bubble. In the Dutch Republic of the 1630s, an unlikely commodity briefly became the object of one of history's most famous financial frenzies. The tulip, a flower newly introduced to Europe from the Ottoman Empire, whose rarest bulbs, especially those with striking, mottled color patterns caused by a then mysterious plant, virus, began fetching extraordinary prices among wealthy collectors. As demand grew, ordinary merchants and craftspeople began buying and reselling tulip bulbs, and even contracts for bulbs not yet harvested, hoping to profit from prices that seemed only to keep climbing. At the height of what's often called tulip mania, in early 1637, a single rare bulb could reportedly sell for as much as a skilled craftsman might earn in several years, an enormous sum for a flower that, in itself, held very little practical use. Then, quite suddenly, in February of that year, buyers at a routine bulb auction failed to show up. Confidence evaporated almost overnight, and prices collapsed dramatically, leaving many who had bought at the peak holding contracts worth a small fraction of what they'd paid. Tulip mania is remembered today less for its economic scale, which some modern historians argue was more contained than old legends suggest, and more for what it reveals so plainly about value itself. A tulip bulb, like a coin, like a banknote, like a stone left in place on the island of Yap, was never worth anything on its own. It was worth exactly what enough people, at a given moment, agreed to believe it was worth, and not one guilder more, once that shared belief quietly slipped away. Chapter 21. The Bank of England and a Nation's Debt. In 1694, facing the enormous costs of ongoing war, the English government chartered the Bank of England, in part specifically to help finance state military spending through a new kind of arrangement. The plan was put forward by a Scottish financier named William Patterson, and the newly formed bank's first great act was to lend the government £1.2 million, an enormous sum for the time, raised from investors eager for the steady interest the arrangement promised. Wealthy investors lent money to the government, and in exchange, the newly formed Bank of England was granted the authority to issue banknotes, in effect turning a portion of the government's debt into a circulating form of money that the public could hold, spend, and trust, backed by confidence in the state's ability to eventually repay what it owed. This arrangement, money whose ultimate backing was the credit and taxing power of a nation, rather than a private goldsmith's vault, marked an important shift, tying a currency's stability directly to public confidence in the government standing behind it, for better and for worse, in ways that remain true of most national currencies even now. Other nations gradually developed similar central banking institutions of their own, and paper currency, once a curiosity Marco Polo brought home in travelers' tales centuries earlier, slowly became an ordinary, unremarkable part of European economic life. Chapter 22. assignats, and a revolution's failed currency. Revolutionary France, in the final years of the 18th century, offers one more sobering example of what happens when a government's paper currency outruns the trust actually backing it. Facing enormous debts inherited from the old monarchy, and urgently needing funds to keep the new revolutionary government running, French authorities issued a paper currency called the assignat, initially backed by the value of church lands that had been seized and nationalized during the Revolution. At first, the assignat held its value reasonably well, tied as it was to a real, tangible asset. But as the government's financial needs grew more desperate, far more assignats were printed than the underlying land could realistically justify, and the currency began losing value rapidly. By the mid-1790s, the assignat had become so devalued that merchants in Paris were reportedly demanding many times its face value in exchange for ordinary goods, if they would accept it at all. The French government eventually abandoned the assignat entirely, moving toward a new currency and eventually toward the more disciplined monetary reforms that eventually produced the French franc under Napoleon. It stands alongside Rome's debasement and Germany's later Weimar crisis as one more entry in this story's quiet, recurring lesson. A currency can be backed by land, by gold, by law, or by nothing at all. But none of those backings mean very much once a government prints far more of it than the trust behind it can actually bear. Chapter 23: Continental Currency and a Young Nation's First Dollars. Across the Atlantic, the American colonies, and later the newly declared United States, went through their own difficult early experiments in currency, well before any gold standard came into the picture at all. Individual colonies, lacking enough British coin in circulation to support everyday trade, issued their own local paper currency, and some regions even relied on more improvised solutions. Virginia, for a time, effectively used tobacco itself as a recognized medium of exchange, with warehouse receipts for stored tobacco circulating much like currency. Echoing, in a very different setting, the old logic of cattle and cacao and salt from earlier in this story. When the Continental Congress needed to finance the Revolutionary War, it issued its own paper currency, known as Continental currency, backed by little more than the promise of a government still fighting for its own existence. Without gold or silver reserves to lend it real weight, and printed in increasingly large quantities to cover mounting wartime costs, the Continental dollar depreciated rapidly, losing much of its value within just a few years. The experience left a lasting mark on the young nation's language itself. The phrase "not worth a continental," meaning something utterly worthless, entered common American speech and persisted long after the war itself had ended. A small, lasting reminder of what happens when a currency's backing is stretched thinner than the trust it's asking people to place in it. Learning directly from this experience, the newly formed United States government moved to establish a more stable footing. The Coinage Act of 1792 formally established the US dollar, based on a defined weight of silver, and created the US Mint to produce coinage under direct federal authority, an attempt to build the new nation's money on firmer ground than the wartime paper that had come before it. Chapter 24: A Private Banker and the Birth of the Federal Reserve. For over a century after its founding, the United States operated without any permanent central bank at all, relying instead on a patchwork of state and national banks. And the currency itself often felt less stable as a result, prone to periodic panics whenever confidence in the banking system wavered. One of the most serious of these came in 1907, when a failed attempt to corner the market on a copper mining company's stock triggered a cascading loss of confidence across New York's banks and trust companies. With no central bank able to step in and calm the panic, it fell, remarkably, to a private individual, the banker John Pierpont Morgan, who personally gathered the city's leading financiers together and organized emergency loans to keep the banking system from collapsing entirely. That a single private citizen's personal intervention had been what stood between the country and a full financial collapse struck many lawmakers as an alarming sign of how fragile the system truly was. The resulting push for reform led, in 1913, to the creation of the Federal Reserve System, the United States' first lasting central bank, designed specifically to act as a stabilizing lender and overseer that wouldn't depend on any one private individual's goodwill or resources ever again. Chapter 25: Gold, Silver, and a Famous Speech. Before the United States settled firmly onto a pure gold standard, it went through decades of heated political argument over whether silver deserved an equal place alongside gold in backing the nation's currency. Farmers and debtors in much of rural America, often struggling under falling crop prices and heavy debts, favored expanding the currency supply by minting silver coins more freely alongside gold, a policy known as free silver, believing it would ease their financial burden and put more money into circulation. Bankers and creditors in the wealthier, more industrial parts of the country generally preferred the stricter discipline of gold alone, worried that too much silver coinage would weaken the currency's overall value. This argument reached its most famous moment in 1896, when the young politician William Jennings Bryan delivered his Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic National Convention, declaring, in one of the most quoted lines in American political history, that working people should not be forced onto a cross of gold. The speech electrified the convention and won him the party's presidential nomination, though he would go on to lose the general election itself. the gold standard ultimately prevailed in the United States, and silver's role in backing the nation's currency gradually faded. But the debate itself is a useful reminder, this deep into the story, that the choice of what actually backs a currency has never been a purely technical question. It has always, at the same time, been a deeply human argument about whose trust and whose interests a currency is really built to serve. Chapter 26: The Gold Standard and the Promise of Stability. By the 19th century, many of the world's major economies had settled on a system known as the gold standard, in which a nation's currency was formally defined as, and could be exchanged for, a fixed quantity of gold. Britain formalized its own commitment to gold in 1821, and other major economies followed over the following decades. Drawn by the stability the system seemed to promise, Germany moved onto gold in 1871, funded in part by the enormous war indemnity it received after defeating France, and the United States, after a long and contentious debate over silver versus gold, settled firmly onto the gold standard by the final years of that same century. If paper currency could always, in principle, be exchanged for a set amount of gold, then its value felt anchored to something real and tangible, rather than resting purely on trust in a government's promises alone. Economists of the time described the system as operating under a set of unwritten rules of the game. Gold would naturally flow out of a country running a trade deficit and into countries it owed, automatically tightening money supply in the deficit country and loosening it elsewhere, in theory keeping the whole international system in a slow, self-correcting balance. For a time, the gold standard helped support a long era of relatively stable exchange rates and expanding international trade. But the system also came with a hidden rigidity. A country's money supply became tied closely to how much gold it physically held, limiting how governments could respond to economic shocks, wars, or financial crises, no matter how urgently more flexibility might have been needed. That rigidity would be tested severely, and in some ways permanently broken, by the demands of the 20th century's great conflicts. Chapter 27: When War Broke the Gold Standard. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 forced many nations to suspend their commitments to the gold standard almost immediately. The enormous costs of modern industrial warfare simply couldn't be financed, while a currency remained strictly tied to existing gold reserves. Some countries attempted to return to a gold-linked system after the war ended, hoping to restore the stability the pre-war years had seemed to offer. Britain, under Winston Churchill as Chancellor of the Exchequer, returned to the gold standard in 1925 at the old, pre-war exchange rate, a decision many economists at the time including John Maynard Keynes, warned was overvalued and economically painful. Britain would abandon gold again just 6 years later, in 1931, as the Depression deepened. The interwar period proved deeply unstable regardless, marked by severe currency crises, hyperinflation in some nations, most famously in Germany's Weimar Republic, where by 1923 the currency had collapsed so completely that stories survive of workers being paid twice a day, rushing to spend their wages before prices rose again by evening, and people reportedly needing wheelbarrows of banknotes simply to buy household basics. And eventually, the Great Depression of the 1930s, a global economic collapse many historians view as worsened, not caused, by countries clinging too rigidly to gold-backed currency at exactly the moment more flexible responses were desperately needed. One by one, through the depths of the Depression, major economies abandoned strict gold convertibility, prioritizing the ability to respond to domestic economic crises over the old promise of a fixed exchange with gold. The gold standard, as it had existed before the war, was effectively finished, even in the places that hadn't yet formally admitted it. Chapter 28: Bretton Woods and the dollar's new role. Toward the end of the Second World War, in July of 1944, representatives from over 40 Allied nations gathered at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new international monetary system for the post-war world. The system they created pegged the value of the United States dollar to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce, while other participating nations' currencies were pegged, in turn, to the dollar. The dollar, in effect, became the world's primary reserve currency, with gold sitting one further step behind it, and new institutions, including the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, were created to help oversee and stabilize this new global arrangement. The British economist John Maynard Keynes, present at the negotiations, actually proposed a rather different system of his own, centered on an entirely new international unit he called banker, intended to avoid tying the whole system so heavily to any single national currency. His proposal was ultimately set aside in favor of the American delegation's dollar-centered plan, reflecting the sheer economic weight the United States carried at the end of the war. For roughly a quarter century, the Bretton Woods system provided a relatively stable framework for international trade and finance, rebuilding a shattered post-war global economy around confidence in the dollar, and behind it, confidence in gold. But by the late 1960s, mounting economic pressures, including the costs of the Vietnam War and rising government spending, began straining the system's core promise. More dollars were circulating internationally than the United States government's gold reserves could realistically back. If every holder had suddenly chosen to redeem them all at once. Chapter 29. Bretton Woods' Quiet Twin Institutions. Alongside the currency arrangements agreed at Bretton Woods in 1944, the delegates gathered there also created two lasting institutions meant to help stabilize and rebuild the post-war global economy, both of which are still with us today, largely unnoticed by most people whose lives they nonetheless touch. The International Monetary Fund was designed to help member countries manage short-term balance of payments difficulties, stepping in with loans and guidance when a nation's currency came under serious strain, in the hope of avoiding the kind of chaotic currency crises that had helped deepen the instability of the interwar years. The World Bank, meanwhile, was created initially to help finance the physical reconstruction of Europe after the devastation of the war, before gradually shifting its focus toward longer-term development projects across poorer nations around the world. Roads, dams, schools, and clinics, financed in no small part through the same basic mechanism running through this entire story. Loans extended on the strength of trust and expected future repayment, just as they had been in Sumerian temple ledgers and Florentine banking houses long before. Chapter 30. The day the dollar left gold behind. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced in a television address that the United States would suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold, a decision later widely referred to as the Nixon shock. The announcement came on a Sunday evening, and stock markets reacted with an immediate, sharp rally the following Monday, as investors absorbed the news that the dollar's link to gold and the constraints that link had placed on economic policy had simply been set aside. Currencies that had been fixed to one another under Bretton Woods began, gradually, to float freely against each other instead, their relative values determined day to day by markets rather than by any fixed peg at all. The move was intended, at the time, as a temporary measure to address mounting economic pressures. But in practice, it marked a permanent turning point, the effective end of the Bretton Woods system, and with it, the end of any major world currency being formally, directly backed by gold. From that point forward, the US dollar, and most of the world's other major currencies alongside it, became what economists call fiat currencies. Money whose value rests not on a promise of physical metal, but purely on legal authority. And underneath that, the same old ingredient that's run through this entire story from its very beginning. Trust. Chapter 31. Bygone Currencies and the Cowrie's Long Retirement. Before moving into money's most modern chapters, it's worth pausing on something quietly remarkable. How long some of the humble currencies from earlier tonight actually lasted, running in parallel with coins, banknotes, and eventually banks, long after most of us would assume they'd faded away entirely. Cowrie shells, first mentioned back near the beginning of this story, remained in active, everyday use as currency across large parts of West Africa well into the 19th century, trading alongside, and sometimes directly against, European coins and later colonial paper currency introduced by trading companies and colonial administrations. Their eventual decline came not from any single dramatic event, but from the same quiet force that has driven nearly every currency shift in this story. Changing patterns of trust and convenience as colonial authorities pushed their own coinage and paper money into wider circulation, and the older shell currencies slowly, unevenly, became less practical to use for larger and more distant transactions. It's a useful reminder, this far into the story, that money rarely disappears all at once, in one clean historical moment. Old and new forms of currency typically overlap for generations, trusted side by side, before one quietly outlasts the other. A pattern likely still playing out today, in ways we won't fully recognize as history until long after tonight. Chapter 32: Fiat Money and the Weight of Collective Belief. Fiat comes from a Latin word meaning, "let it be done," and it describes currency that has value simply because a government declares it legal tender, and because enough people, businesses, and institutions collectively agree to treat it as valuable in turn. This can sound, at first, unsettling. A dollar bill, a euro note, contains no gold, no silver, nothing of matching intrinsic worth. Its value exists only because millions of people, largely without ever discussing it directly, continue behaving as though it does. And yet, in a sense, this has quietly been true of money all along, stretching back to that first Lydian stamped coin, whose true worth always depended a little on trust in the authority behind the stamp, not merely the metal itself. Fiat currency gives governments and central banks considerably more flexibility to respond to economic crises than a strict gold standard ever allowed. But that same flexibility carries its own long-documented risks, including the danger of inflation if a currency is issued carelessly or in excess, undermining the very trust the whole system depends on. Central banks in the Fiat era took on a quiet, careful balancing role that simply hadn't existed in the same way under a gold standard. Adjusting interest rates, managing the money supply, watching inflation and employment figures closely, all in an ongoing, largely invisible effort to keep the shared story of a currency's value steady and believable, year after year, without the automatic discipline gold once seemed to provide. History offers sobering examples of exactly what happens when that trust breaks down completely. Germany's Weimar hyperinflation earlier in this story is one, and more recently, Zimbabwe's currency in the late 2000s suffered such extreme hyperinflation that the government eventually issued banknotes with a face value of $100 trillion. Notes that, by the time they were printed, could barely buy a loaf of bread. These episodes stand as rare, extreme exceptions rather than the rule, but they illustrate plainly what every currency in this story, all the way back to that first Lydian stamp, has ultimately depended on. Not the paper, not the metal, but the trust behind it, carefully maintained or carelessly spent. Chapter 33, From Ledgers to Bits. Through the 20th century, and accelerating rapidly into the 21st, an enormous and quiet shift took place in what money actually consists of in practice for most people. Checks, credit cards, and eventually online banking meant that most money most people interact with day to day was never physical at all. Simply numbers held in secure databases, moving from one account's ledger entry to another with a keystroke or a tap. The modern credit card traces back to a fairly ordinary, almost accidental origin story of its own. In 1950, a businessman named Frank McNamara reportedly found himself embarrassed at a New York restaurant after forgetting his wallet, and the experience helped inspire the Diners Club card, one of the first modern charge cards, allowing members to pay at participating restaurants and settle the bill later, all without cash changing hands at the table at all. Banks soon followed with their own versions, extending the same basic idea from a small circle of restaurants to nearly every kind of purchase imaginable. And by the later 20th century, a small plastic card linked to a bank's own ledger somewhere far away had quietly become one of the most common ways value changed hands at all in much of the world. A direct, distant descendant of that same Florentine bill of exchange, letting a merchant in one place trust a promise rooted somewhere else entirely. In just the last couple of decades, an entirely new chapter has begun taking shape alongside the older banking system. Cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, introduced in 2009, and various digital currencies now being explored directly by central banks, represent the newest attempt to answer this story's oldest question in a new way. How to let people who don't know each other trust a shared record of value, this time using cryptography and distributed computer networks instead of a king's stamp, a goldsmith's vault, or a central bank's promise. It's far too early in that particular chapter's own history to know how it will ultimately read. But the underlying question driving it is exactly the same one this whole story has followed from its very beginning. What's quietly remarkable, sitting here so late in the story, is how familiar the basic shape of this newest idea actually is, once you've heard everything that came before it tonight. A distributed, shared ledger that many separate parties all trust and verify together, without needing to rely on any single central authority. In some ways, it echoes the ancient Yap Islanders and their great stones far more closely than it echoes a modern bank vault. value tracked by shared, verified agreement, rather than by anyone actually holding a physical object at all. An old idea, wearing an entirely new, unfamiliar coat. In this sense, the Goldsmiths' handwritten receipt and the modern bank transfer are closer cousins than they might first appear. Both represent a claim on value, trusted and honored by an institution, rather than the value itself changing hands directly. Paper money itself, for that matter, was always only ever a claim to, all the way back to Song Dynasty China. Electronic transfer systems built through the later 20th century, with names most people never think twice about, quietly became the plumbing carrying nearly all of this value around the world. Interbank networks capable of moving enormous sums between institutions within moments. Systems that most account holders never see or think about directly, yet rely on every single time a paycheck arrives, a bill is paid, or a card is tapped at a shop counter. Today, most of the money that exists in the world isn't sitting in any vault or printed in any mint at all. It exists purely as entries in interconnected banking systems, moved and tracked electronically, resting ultimately on the same ancient foundation. This entire story has followed from the very beginning. Shared trust, formalized, recorded, and passed carefully from one generation, one system, one technology, to the next. Chapter 34. What money actually is after all this time. So, after cattle and salt and cacao, after Lydian stamps and Athenian owls, after Chinese paper and Templar letters and Medici ledgers, after gold standards raised and abandoned and dollars unmoored from gold entirely. What is money, really, underneath all of it? It was never really the cattle, or the salt, or the metal, or the paper, or the numbers on a screen that held the value not on their own. Those were only ever the vessel. The actual substance of money, from the very first informal debt remembered between two neighbors, has always been trust. A shared, often unspoken agreement among a great many people to treat something as valuable together at the same time. Even gold itself, so often treated as the one truly solid, honest exception in this whole story, isn't entirely free of this pattern. Gold has some real industrial and ornamental uses, but nowhere near enough, on its own, to explain the enormous value people have placed on it for thousands of years. Much of gold's worth, too, has always rested on a very old, very widely shared agreement that it should be worth a great deal. Which means even our oldest, most real form of money was, in its own quiet way, a story people agreed to believe together the whole time. Think of it this way one more time before we let it rest. If every person on Earth woke up tomorrow and simply stopped believing a particular currency held any value at all, no army, no vault, No law could really force that belief back into existence. And yet, every single day, without any conscious effort at all, billions of people wake up and quietly renew that same belief anyway, simply by going about their lives as though the money in their pocket or their bank account still means exactly what it meant yesterday. That quiet, largely unconscious daily renewal, repeated by nearly everyone, everywhere, is arguably the largest act of collective trust our species performs, every single day, without ever really thinking about it at all. That's a strange thing to sit with, late at night. That so much of the world's activity, so much of what people spend their lives working toward, rests not on anything solid at all, but on a story millions of people quietly agree to keep telling each other day after day, generation after generation. And yet none of this makes money any less real, in the ways that actually matter for a life. The trust behind it is real trust, built by real people, tested across thousands of years, refined through failures and collapses, and quiet, patient rebuilding, again and again. A farmer trusting a neighbor, a pilgrim trusting a Templar house, a merchant trusting a Florentine ledger, a citizen trusting the small, printed promise on a banknote. The same simple act, repeated in 1,000 different costumes. Across every century, this story has passed through tonight. It might help, drifting off tonight, to think of money less as a thing, and more as a very long, very quiet conversation. One that started with a debt remembered between two neighbors, thousands of years before anyone wrote anything down at all, and has simply continued in different languages, different materials, different centuries, ever since. Every coin, every banknote, every quiet bank transfer, just one more small exchange in that same conversation, still being carried on, right now, all around the world, even as you rest here tonight. Chapter 35, What Remains. Money will very likely keep changing shape long after tonight. New forms, new technologies, new arrangements of trust that would have seemed as strange to us as paper money once seemed to Marco Polo's audience centuries ago. Think back for a moment, one last time, across everything that's passed through this story tonight. A farmer's cattle in a Bronze Age field, a merchant weighing salt on a desert road, a market stall in Tenochtitlan, cacao beans counted out one by one, a Lydian smith stamping a small lump of electrum, an Athenian owl coin crossing the Mediterranean in a stranger's purse, a Song Dynasty official signing a sheet of mulberry paper, a Templar scribe writing a coded letter for a pilgrim bound for Jerusalem, a Florentine banker balancing 2 columns in a ledger by candlelight, a London goldsmith writing out a simple paper receipt. All of it, every single piece, resting on the same quiet, shared agreement to trust. But underneath, whatever form it takes next, it will likely still be doing the same quiet work it's always done, all the way back to that first remembered debt between two neighbors. Letting people who don't fully know each other and may never meet still find a way to trust one another just enough to trade a little of what they have for a little of what they need. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. Let the numbers and the coins and the old kingdoms fade quietly now. Let your thoughts loosen and drift and settle. If this story helped you rest, a like, a subscribe, or a follow, wherever you're listening, helps it find someone else who needs a little help falling asleep too. But that's a thought for tomorrow, not tonight. For now, just rest. Let go of the coins and the ledgers and the long, quiet history behind them. You're safe, you're comfortable, and there's nowhere else you need to be right now. Let your breathing slow, gently, on its own. There's no history left to follow now. No dates, no kingdoms, no ledgers. Just this quiet room, this quiet moment, and the soft, steady dark settling in around you. Whatever tomorrow asks of you can wait until tomorrow. Right now, there's only rest. Only this slow, easy breathing. Only the gentle, comfortable weight of the blankets, and the quiet and the dark. Sleep now. Drift all the way down. You've earned this rest, and it will still be here, waiting for as long as you need it. Good night, and sleep well.